After World War II, justice did not always come dressed in black robes or handed down from wooden benches in the ruins of Eastern Europe, where entire cities had been turned into ash and the ground still reeked of gunpowder and grief. Another kind of justice took root, one without mercy, one that used the human body itself as a symbol. Pole hanging, no trapdoor, no sudden snap of the neck, just a wooden post, a rope, and slow, deliberate death. It wasn't justice, some would later say. It was theater. But for those who watched, for the ones who had suffered and waited years to see someone pay, it felt like something more. It felt necessary. This is the story of Europe's most brutal execution method. A punishment so raw, it was banned almost as quickly as it had appeared, but not before it left behind black and white photographs that still seem to scream. If you're new here, subscribe. These are the stories of war they don't teach in schools, and some of them might stay with you. May 1945, the war was over. But the wounds weren't. Not in Budapest, not in Prague. They still walked past mass graves and buildings with bullet holes so deep you could see through to the next street. And the people, those who survived, wanted answers. More than that, they wanted punishment. Not symbolic justice, but something real. The kind of justice you could look in the eye. And for men like Karl Hermann Frank, Ferenc Szálasi, and András Kun, that meant one thing. The pole hanging wasn't invented in 1945. Its roots went back to the Austro-Hungarian army, where it was used on deserters. But it re-emerged with new purpose in post-war Czechoslovakia and Hungary. To make the condemned suffer, the method was horrifyingly simple. No gallows, no drop, a single vertical wooden post, about 10 feet high. The condemned was tied up, hands behind the back, feet locked, a rope around the neck. It went over a pulley, controlled by an executioner standing to the side. He pulled, not hard, not fast, just enough to lift the chest, enough to make the prisoner rise for a second, and then let gravity do the rest. Slowly, so slowly, the rope tightened, the throat closed, the lungs begged for air, the eyes bulged, the face changed color. And it didn't end in seconds. It could take up to 5 minutes for death to arrive, 5 minutes in front of a crowd. In Budapest, they did it in front of the Music Academy. In Prague, at Pankrak prison, thousands came. Some brought children, some remained silent, others shouted, but they all watched. Some of them had spent the war hiding in basements. Others had lost mothers, brothers, sons, and now they were there. To see the faces of the men who had ordered the killings become twisted in panic. Executioners weren't amateurs. They were professionals. Trained men who had done this before. Reports say they could control the rope's tension, speed up the death or slow it down. Not out of sadism, out of protocol, out of state design. The condemned were dressed in the same uniforms they wore during their crimes. SS black, Arrow Cross green, a final humiliation. And a reminder, look at this man. Remember what he did. But why this method? Why not a bullet? Why not the gallows, like in Nuremberg? Because this was not about efficient justice. It was about making a statement. In Hungary, it had a special meaning. During the war, Arrow Cross death squads had taken thousands of Jews to the Danube, tied them together, shot only a few, let the rest drown, still bound. Pole hanging mirrored that slow, suffocating death. It was not an accident. It was deliberate. It was a reversal. The Hungarian state saying, "Now you will gasp," and gasp they did. Karl Hermann Frank, one of Hitler's top enforcers in Bohemia, stood on the post on May 22, 1946, before 5,000 people, some of them relatives of the villagers he had ordered slaughtered. Ferenc Szálasi, the self-declared leader of the nation, followed weeks later. Wearing the green shirt of the arrow cross, the square was silent. No applause, no cheers, just breathing, just eyes, just the sound of rope against wood. The message was clear. Europe was not just rebuilding roads and governments. It was rebuilding moral order. And these executions were part of it. But already cracks were forming. Some began to question whether this was justice or a new form of barbarity. Did public killing cleanse the soul, or did it stain it further? Yet in that moment, in 1945, 1946, 1947, there was no debate. Only the post, the rope, and the crowd. You don't understand pole hanging until you understand its silence. Not the crowd, not the screams, the method itself. No snap, no drop. Just a soundless choke that tightened second by second. Even the condemned often made no sound, not because they were brave, but because they couldn't. Their windpipe closed before their words could reach the crowd. That silence was the method's true weapon. It didn't just kill, it erased power, made monsters into struggling flesh. Pole hanging wasn't born in the ashes of World War II. It had a history, a cold, calculated one, used by the Austro-Hungarian army during World War I. It was a punishment for traitors and deserters. The state didn't want martyrs. It wanted deterrence. Soldiers who watched a slow death remembered it, feared it. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about imprinting fear onto the brain permanently. In the 1940s, that logic returned. But this time, it wasn't for soldiers. It was for ideologues, mass murderers in uniform, men who had sent thousands to their deaths with the stroke of a pen, and now they would die not by tribunal protocol, but by historical echo. Mechanically, the method was almost primitive. The pole, any upright beam at least 3 meters high, was driven into the ground or attached to a frame. The rope, no thicker than a man's thumb, was looped once. No harness, no trapdoor, no platform. Just the condemned standing on a stool, or sometimes a car tire. While the executioner held the line like a puppeteer, the rope ran over a pulley or metal ring fixed at the top. When the time came, the stool was kicked away, or the rope was hoisted manually. This part was crucial. Unlike the classic gallows, there was no free fall. The neck didn't break. Instead, the full weight of the body bore down on the throat. The pressure closed the airway slowly, agonizingly. What followed was called the dance. The legs began to kick, first small, then wild. The torso twisted, searching for relief, for leverage, for breath. The tongue swelled, eyes rolled, fingers clawed the air. This could last a minute, sometimes 3, sometimes more. The body betrayed itself, urine, feces, muscles shaking, then going still. In Hungary, some reports describe the rope as being short enough to ensure the toes still brushed the ground. They could try to stand, but never fully. It extended the death, made it theatrical. In some cases, guards were instructed to let them hang for 5 full minutes. Alive, observers stood with watches. Time was part of the punishment. Time was the message. You will not die quickly. You will remember what you did, second by second, until your brain loses light. But there was more. Executions were often scheduled at dawn. The condemned were given their last words. Though few managed to say anything coherent, in Budapest, Szálasi was reported to have murmured a prayer before the rope cut his breath. Karl Hermann Ferenc stared into the crowd, didn't speak. He knew. They knew. There were guards, medics, photographers. Some wore suits, others uniforms, and always, always a crowd. Thousands came, old women, teenage boys, survivors with yellowed ghetto tattoos. Some crossed themselves, others stared with open hatred. In a few rare moments, someone would cry. But most just watched, not because they were bloodthirsty, but because they needed to see the scales tilt. In their minds, this wasn't brutality. It was balance. In Prague, the Pankrak prison built a reinforced wooden frame for the Poles. Executioners trained for weeks. Rehearsals were held. Protocols were written. This wasn't chaos. It was a state act, justice, scripted and rehearsed. One eyewitness recalled the moment the body went limp. "The legs stopped moving," he said. But it was the hands. They still twitched, like they were trying to reach back, like they weren't ready. Some of the condemned lost control. They screamed. They begged. Others, rarely, held posture to the end. One Arrow Cross officer reportedly spat at the guards before his face turned purple. He died with a rope cutting into his jaw. And when it was over, the bodies were cut down, laid on wooden boards, examined, sometimes displayed briefly, then buried in unmarked graves, names erased. Not for dignity, but for punishment. No memory, no martyrs, but the memory didn't fade. Those who watched never forgot the way the rope tightened, the way the feet dangled, the way the body jerked like a puppet with snapped strings. They didn't forget the sound of silence, of a man realizing there was no way back. Pole hanging wasn't just a method. It was a language. The state was speaking, saying, "We saw what you did, and now everyone else will too." There were names, names people whispered for years, names that smelled of smoke and blood, names that once held power and now ended in rope. Karl, Hermann, Frank, Ferenc, Szálasi. They weren't just men. They were architects of fear, and their final moments became symbols, not just of justice, but of what a nation is willing to do when it decides never again. Karl Hermann Frank wasn't Hungarian. He was German, born in Karlovy Vary, a bureaucrat with a face like paper, pale, neat, always calm. But behind that face was the machine. In 1939, he became the SS and police leader in Bohemia and Moravia. What the Nazis called the Protectorate of Czechoslovakia, he answered to Heydrich. And when Heydrich was assassinated in 1942, Frank answered with death. What followed was Liddis on June 10, 1942. Nazi forces, under Frank's order, wiped out the village of Liddis. All the men were shot. The women sent to concentration camps. The children, those considered racially suitable, were sent to be Germanized. The rest disappeared. No trials, no defense, just erasure. All because the Czechs dared to resist. Frank ran the Protectorate like a spreadsheet of terror. Reports say he personally signed off on hundreds of executions. Not with emotion, not with shouting, with ink, quietly, methodically. When the war ended, he tried to hide. But the Czechs remembered, and they wanted more than a courtroom verdict. On May 22, 1946, Frank stood on the scaffold in Pankrak prison, pale as ever, dressed in black. They had built a special post. It stood higher, cleaner. Cameras were set, microphones too. This wasn't just a death. It was a transmission. Eyewitnesses said Frank remained calm. He refused a blindfold. When the rope was placed around his neck, he adjusted his collar. Then he looked at the crowd. 5,000 people. No screams, no shouts, just breath. Held, together. The executioner pulled. Frank rose, then fell. Slowly, he didn't struggle much. Maybe he was prepared. Maybe he was resigned. Maybe he knew that after Liddis, after years of cold orders and cold eyes, this was how it had to end. It took 3 minutes. Then there was Ferenc Szálasi. He called himself Nemzetvezető, leader of the nation. Hungary's last fascist prime minister, head of the Arrow Cross Party, the Hungarian Nazis. His rise came in October 1944, when the Germans removed Horthy and installed Szálasi as their puppet. In those final months of the war, Szálasi's government unleashed hell. Arrow Cross death squads roamed Budapest. Jews were dragged from their homes, beaten, shot, thrown into the Danube with stones tied to their feet. Women raped, synagogues looted. Thousands were marched in winter with no food, no shoes. It wasn't just collaboration, it was enthusiasm. Szálasi believed he was chosen. He filled speeches with talk of spiritual renewal and national destiny. But behind those words were orders. Thousands died because of his signature. And when Budapest fell, he ran. Captured in Austria, brought back in chains, at his trial in March 1946, Szálasi was defiant, never apologized, never admitted guilt. He called his government morally intact. The judges didn't care. The people didn't either. On March 12th, he was taken to the pole. He wore the Arrow Cross uniform, green shirt, black tie. Reporters say his eyes were vacant. He didn't fight, didn't cry. He just stood. The rope was set. The crowd watched. He whispered something. No one heard it. Then they pulled. His body convulsed. Legs kicked. His face turned dark. It took longer than Ferenc. The executioner may have slowed the lift. Deliberate, symbolic. When it was over, there was no applause, just silence. Some turned away. Others stayed, eyes locked on the pole, not for satisfaction, not for revenge, for memory. Both men had commanded armies. Both had sat in offices lined with leather and steel. Both had given orders that destroyed lives, and now they dangled like any other criminal. The message was brutal. Simple: your titles die before you do. Afterward, their bodies were removed quickly. No graves, no flowers. Their names would be etched only in the memories of survivors, and in the photos the state kept, locked away for decades. But ask anyone who was there, who saw it, who smelled the rope and the sweat and the fear. They'll tell you the same thing. They remember the faces. Not all killers looked like soldiers. Some wore cassocks, some carried prayer books. András Kun was one of them, a priest in title, a fanatic in truth, the man who turned the gospel into a gun. He wasn't famous, not like Szálasi or Ferenc, but his cruelty left a stain so deep that even now, in Hungary's memory, his name burns. Kun was a Franciscan friar, a man of God in theory. But during the final years of the war, he commanded a death squad under the Arrow Cross. Yes, commanded, not blessed, not watched from afar. Led, he carried a pistol. He gave orders. He quoted scripture before killing in the winter of 1944. Kun's unit entered a Jewish hospital in Budapest. Inside were patients. Many bedridden, nurses, children, survivors from earlier pogroms. He lined them up, over 50 people, walked among them, selecting victims like cattle, then gave the order. His squad opened fire. Blood soaked the hallways. Screams bounced off stone walls. He walked among the bodies, checking for survivors, finishing them with single shots, a priest. Then came the Danube. His unit, dubbed the prayer group by survivors, specialized in riverside executions. Victims were tied together, shot in the back. Their bodies toppled into the freezing water. Sometimes he made them sing hymns first. He claimed God had chosen him to purify Hungary after the war. Kun was caught in civilian clothes, denied everything. But witnesses came forward. Dozens, survivors who remembered his face, his voice, his black robe. One woman described how he prayed before executing her husband, said he was sending him to God. The court didn't need long. The sentence, death by pole, on September 19, 1945. Kun was led to the execution site in Budapest. There were fewer people that day. Perhaps the public couldn't bear to watch a priest die, or perhaps they didn't care. Maybe they had seen too much already. He wore black, a different black this time, not clerical. Prison issue, thin fabric clung to his body. He looked smaller than people remembered. He was silent. When the rope was placed, he looked up, toward the sky. Some say he muttered a prayer. Others say he whispered nothing. And then the rope lifted. It was fast. His legs kicked hard. His arms jerked behind him. The face turned red, then blue. And then stillness. A man of God, gone in silence. But he wasn't the only one who died that week. Laszlo Endre followed. Endre wasn't a killer in uniform. He was something worse. A killer behind a desk. As State Secretary for the Interior Ministry, Endre helped organize the deportation of over 400,000 Hungarian Jews in just 8 weeks. It was called the fastest mass deportation in Nazi-controlled Europe. Trains left daily to Auschwitz. Full, efficient, systematic, Endre coordinated local police. Arranged timetables, signed requisitions for cattle cars. He didn't pull triggers. He made sure others did. When the Germans invaded Hungary in March 1944, Endre embraced them. He believed Hungary should be ethnically cleansed, that Jews were foreign elements. He once wrote that deportation was a biological necessity. After the war, he was arrested and tried alongside other Arrow Cross leaders. He wore glasses, looked like a clerk. But the numbers he had moved were inhuman. During the trial, he was arrogant. He defended the deportations as lawful, claimed he had followed orders, said his conscience was clear. The court didn't agree. On the day of his execution, Endre reportedly wept, not for his victims, but for himself. When they tied the rope, he begged for a bullet. They refused. The rope tightened, his feet kicked, his glasses fell, he choked. And then, like the others, stillness. These two men represented opposite ends of the same horror. Kun, the fanatic with a gun and a Bible. Endre, the bureaucrat of genocide. One acted with violence, the other with paperwork, but the result was the same. Death of thousands. And now they shared the same post. The crowd didn't cheer, didn't weep, just watched, because by then, in Budapest, rope had become routine. Yet something changed after Kun and Endre. The executions continued, but the silence grew heavier. Even the survivors who came to watch began to question what they were watching, not because they doubted guilt, but because they were tired of death, of ropes, of the dance. Something in the air shifted, and the post, once a symbol of justice, began to feel like a monument to something darker. It didn't end with a declaration. No law was passed, no speech given, but by 1948, the poles were gone. Dismantled quietly, rope executions disappeared from courtyards and prisons. Hungary and Czechoslovakia moved on, or tried to. Justice had been served, the state claimed. The enemies of the people had paid, but the photographs remained, black and white, grainy, motion frozen mid-struggle, faces twisted in that final moment, rope taut, body suspended, sometimes mid-kick, sometimes still. They weren't in official state documents. They weren't meant for history books, yet somehow they endured, in archives, in drawers, in memories, and they asked questions, not about guilt. No one mourned Szálasi or Kun or Ferenc. Their crimes were beyond dispute, but what lingered was the method, the pole, the rope, the crowd, the calm choreography of death. Was it justice or was it something else? In the early 1950s, as Soviet influence deepened, The new regimes found rope hanging inconvenient. It reminded people of a different kind of rage, of grassroots fury, of public spectacle, and they didn't want that. They preferred bullets, closed trials, silence. Pole hanging was phased out, not condemned, just erased. But survivors remembered not just the crimes, but the aftermath, the waiting, the days they stood in cold squares watching men who had once been gods turned into twitching shadows. Some said it helped, that seeing the faces collapse brought peace. Others said it didn't. That revenge, even righteous, leaves a second wound. And then there were the children, some too young to understand what they'd witnessed. Others who remembered every second, the smell of rope, the way the crowd held its breath, the twitch of a toe. Some grew up angry, others quiet. Some became historians, others never spoke again. The truth is, rope doesn't end suffering, it just transfers it. Justice is supposed to close a chapter. Pole hanging opened another, and yet there's a reason the images still exist. The reason they resurface in articles, documentaries, late-night forums. Because they ask a question that has no easy answer. When someone commits unspeakable evil, what is the right way to end them? Is it a trial, a verdict, a cell, or is it a rope? Today, you can visit Lidis. It's a memorial now. Flowers grow where homes once stood. There's a museum. Black stone walls, names carved. Karl Hermann Frank isn't mentioned. You can visit the Danube, stand on the bank, look at the shoes, the iron sculptures where bodies once fell into the water. You can walk Budapest streets, read about Szálasi, Kun, André, but the Poles? They're gone. No statues, no markers, just silence. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe not. But if you've made it this far, if you felt even a fraction of what these moments meant, not just to those who died, but to those who watched, you'll understand. The rope wasn't just a method. It was a mirror, held up to a continent that had lost its soul and was desperate to get it back, no matter what it cost.